thank you so much for joining us as we discuss the restoration economy and how it can help make us stronger. So you can go to the next slide, Eugenia.
Yeah.
Okay, the next one. So we are Wildlands League, and we are experts in protecting the natural world. Next. We've been around since 1968. We started with a campaign to get logging out of all provincial parks. Next. And that's me, Jannett Sumner. I'm the executive director at Wildlands League, and I've been a professional environmentalist for over 30 years. I'm having a good day at the office. Thanks, Eugenia. Next.
Okay, so that is me. Welcome everybody to our second webinar, Emerging Stronger. It's great to be here with Jannett and our guest speaker today, Dave. Just some housekeeping things before we get started. If you've joined our webinar, your video and your speakers should be muted. And if you're listening via phone, please make sure that your microphone is muted to reduce any background noise. Each speaker today will have about 12 to 15 minutes to speak, and then we'll have 15 minutes for questions at the end. If you have any questions, you can feel free to pop them in the Q&A box, which should be at the bottom of your screen. And I will be monitoring these questions so that we can answer them at the end. However, if you have any burning questions, please feel free to drop them in the box, and Jannett and Dave would be happy to answer them during their presentations as well. At the end of this webinar, please complete our survey. We'd love to know how we did or any improvements that we could do. And also there is a chance for you to sign up for receiving our native Ontario wildflower seeds. So stay tuned. All right, Jannett, thanks.
All right, thanks. Next slide. So the work of Wildlands League is to work on protecting the natural world, as I said, but the natural world is experiencing grave losses. Species are going extinct, and this is turning into an existential and urgent threat. We work on the extinction crisis and how it overlaps with climate change, because of course we're not going to meet our climate change targets unless we get 30% of the solution from nature. So it's our job to find the solutions both to the extinction crisis and the overlap on how nature can contribute on the climate change front. That's what we do at Wildlands League. Next slide. I want to acknowledge that we're still very much in the midst of the pandemic, and the future is not yet known. And many are keeping us safe on the front lines. And at Wildlands League, we're actually laying down the plans to help emerge stronger and more resilient as society recovers from COVID. And we see that as part of our job to do that right now. Next slide. And that brings us to today's topic and why we're talking about the restoration economy. The restoration economy, if you were to look it up online, it says it's economic activity associated with regenerative land use. So it's ecological activities and it's regenerating those. And it stands sort of, it's kind of a contrast, if you will, to an economy that is built on unending sprawl, resource extraction. It's kind of the reverse of that. And it's meant to be any activities that are repairing damage to the natural world and to human communities. It's almost like a metaphor, if you will, for us emerging from COVID. Next slide. So, sorry, Dave and I are going to show you how working with nature can help to create more climate resilient cities, bring nature back, and build a prosperous restoration economy for emerging stronger. Next slide. So the question becomes, how can we work with nature? Next slide. So these are all different ways in which we can actually be regenerating and restoring nature. And at Wildlands League, we've started to think about, could we actually combine all of these and start to talk about a restoration economy that really was built on a nature strategy for Southern Canada, and think about it as doing so to actually rebuild and regenerate this economy. And what that means is working in areas around cities, inside cities, near urban areas, to find those that are still intact or natural areas and protect them. So that's the top left quadrant. finding ways to create near urban protection. Then to the right of that, in the top right, is green infrastructure. Green infrastructure is about building infrastructure. So many people know about what we call gray infrastructure, where you have water pipes, you might have rivers or streams where you've actually created concrete on the side of it to make the water flow faster and bigger and deeper. And that's kind of the opposite to green infrastructure. Green infrastructure is about, systems of grassed areas, wetlands, ponds, meadows, naturalized riverbanks, sorry, and all of that combined, and how it can become a network or a spider web of green infrastructure that spreads out from the city and out into the rural areas. So building that green infrastructure using the anchor of the near urban protection, connecting it with green infrastructure and taking it out to the rural landscape. And then once you get out into the rural landscape, there's all sorts of ways that we can contribute to building this network of natural areas, whether it's woodlots or farmers' fields, where farmers are actually doing stewardship projects, maybe regeneration, bringing back certain species, those kinds of things. And down in the bottom right is the restoration piece, which quite frankly can be done on all three of the others, but also can be in isolated incidences or less sort of seemingly connected, but still contributing, where you might be growing native plants on your garden and on your property. You might have the business across the street who decides to do a restoration project on their property. It could be the schoolyard. It could be anybody who is contributing, local gardeners. You yourself might already be doing this. And there are other groups that work on this particular piece. I believe we had Carolina in Canada on a couple of weeks ago, and they were talking about growing the world's largest wildlife garden or wildflower garden. And they're doing that through the planting of native seeds. David Suzuki Foundation and World Wildlife Fund are also working on bringing back butterfly habitat. So we can all contribute in this restoration economy, and you might not even know that you were part of it. But that's what it means to bring all of this together and think of it as a strategy and how we could actually come back stronger from COVID. Next slide. Here's an example of what that looks like. This is Rouge Park. You can see that this is a natural area, and there are many places across Canada where we should be looking to have new national urban parks, or thinking about how we can have near urban protection. You've got Ojibwe Shores in Windsor. We're going to hear more about that from Dave. We've got the Mewasin First Nation who would like to see a project like this in Saskatoon. Birch Cove Lakes in Halifax. How can we connect the Ottawa River in a more naturalized way to Gatineau, and perhaps move that forward as a national urban park? There are many, many, many examples right across this country, and we should not, even though we're using many Ontario examples, this is really just a template for how to describe it. Next slide. As I mentioned, in our cities, thinking about all the different green spaces that we could be using and creating and planting along roadways and in our subdivisions. Next slide. Here's a very typical example of riverbanks and creating natural water courses that would bring nature into our cities and actually connect out to the broader rural landscape. Next slide. And of course, once you're out in farmers' fields or woodlots, they can all be contributing to this network of natural areas. And going beyond private land trusts who are building places that will be protected as well, and actually restoring those and bringing back nature. So it works again as you get out into the broader landscape, both on the agricultural, woodlots, and private land trust areas, and some townships that can all be contributing to this network of natural areas. Next slide. So what it is about bringing all those puzzle pieces together, thinking about them as not disaggregated, isolated incidences, but how can they actually work to create this network of natural areas using the protected areas, your anchor, naturalizing areas outside of that, and then building green infrastructure on purpose so it creates this connected network out to the rural landscape, and then connecting into places like agricultural initiatives, woodlots, and more. Next slide. So I promised we'd actually be talking about the economic piece of this as well. And so I'll give you some of the jobs, and this is just some of them, and many of them work in all 4 quadrants. So some of the jobs that we would be thinking about is design and planning. Obviously, you'd have to do that before you set upon doing some of these projects. Some of these projects would be in the millions of dollars, so you'd want to have a good design and a good plan to actually execute. You'd need engineering expertise, maintenance, facilitation, and communications. For example, when they were planning to do Rouge National Urban Park, you couldn't just sort of say, oh, here's the decree, we're going to do it. It took many, many years of consultation across all kinds of stakeholders, working with Indigenous peoples, thinking about how can we meet the needs of as many people as possible and create a new national urban park. That conversation is just going on right now in Windsor, and we're working with Bryan Massey and many others in the Windsor area to have a conversation about what could a new national urban park look like in Windsor. And this is happening across the country. It's happening in Halifax, it's happening in Saskatoon, it's happening all across this country. You need landscape architects, you need scientists. Again, if you're going to do species reintroduction programs, you need the science and the scientists, academics and youth that might be working on those projects. You need technical and environmental consultants. You need building contractors, the folks that can actually drive the excavators and do the landscaping, project managers who can oversee it. And of course, you need all different levels of government who would be working on the design and helping with permits and providing, in some cases, funding and working together with the private sector and the environmental sector and thinking about how do we actually execute these projects and get the greatest good. Obviously also working with Indigenous people because we share the land, and thinking about how the Indigenous knowledge systems can be, we can learn from each other and integrate those and have a conversation in terms of these renaturalization projects, conservation authorities and land trusts. As I said, this is not just private, public land or private land, it's a combination of both, and thinking about how those work together. So you have jobs right across that, and also in the financial sector. But let me drill down a little bit more and give you some of the numbers. If you look at the top right quadrant on Green Infrastructure Ontario recently did a report, and I found it fascinating. And they looked at some of the job numbers for just green infrastructure in Ontario alone. And in 2018, there were approximately 103,000 jobs in Ontario associated with green infrastructure. And they forecast, if you were to actually do a bit more of an alignment between policy and purpose, actually set some targets and try to really do green infrastructure on purpose and try to drive it and not have barriers to it, you could expect to grow that sector up to 250,400 jobs by 2030. That's more than 140,000 jobs just from Ontario alone, and just in one quadrant of this. So if you were to think about all 4 quadrants being part of your restoration economy, and then on purpose designing this so that you did it for the full capacity that you could across the country in every city where you wanted to grow and expand out to the rural landscape, you could be looking at hundreds of thousands of jobs. And that's why we think on purpose, actually investing in and thinking about a nature strategy that works for Southern Canada that actually can grow the restoration economy. Next slide, and I think we have a poll coming up. So Eugene is just going to post a poll, and hopefully everybody can participate and tell us what you think. At this point, I think we should have mood music or something so that people are filling out the poll and there's a little bit of a discussion going on.
Yeah, I think most people have commented, so I will launch the results.
Okay. Thanks for participating. Ah, that's awesome. So next slide. Thanks for doing this, Eugenia, by the way. Fundamentally, a restoration economy will not only be good for nature, but it will actually help, it will help heal nature. It'll also be good for building climate smart cities, bringing biodiversity back and more resilience. It's a metaphor for our time. As I said, it's helping heal the planet and heal ourselves. And as we emerge stronger, it is good to be thinking about how we can be stronger, not only economically, but in our connection to nature and having more functional cities. Next slide. When I traveled to Rouge National Urban Park, and this is a slide directly from one of our events in Rouge, I think about the fact that not every city has this. And why don't we have a national urban park or a nationally protected area in a city or close to every city across Canada? We think it's possible. And not only that, but we think it's a missed economic opportunity if we're not considering how to grow the restoration economy and rejuvenate nature in and around our cities. Next slide. So I'm going to turn it over very shortly to Dave, and Dave's going to be really showing you how this could work in Southern Ontario and in Central Ontario. And those are meant to be not definitive, and that's the only place that it works, but rather thinking about it as this is a template. This is how it could work in this location. And it, as I said, it can work everywhere across this country, from where we have cities right across the country. It's a theory around rebuilding, anchoring nature, and then building a network out and connecting it to the broader landscape. And it's the economic drivers that facilitate that are part of the restoration economy. So Dave, you're going to take it away from here. Thanks.
And just so we're keeping track of time, it's 12:15 now. So take it away, Dave.
Thanks very much. Hopefully you can see my screen now. Looking good? Okay. I'm Dave Pearce. I'm Forest Conservation Manager for Wildlands League. Thanks, Janet. Thanks very much. Excellent presentation. And as Janet said, I'll be providing some examples of how nature connectivity and connection in our restoration economy could work in a couple places in Southern Ontario. And we're talking about landscapes, and we're talking about landscapes that are still the territory of many First Nations communities across Ontario. But this is a landscape that I'm familiar with. It's the North Shore of a place called White Lake in the Ottawa Valley, and it's very similar to some of the landscapes we'll be talking about. And there's many people have connections to different types of landscapes. And I'm from the Ottawa Valley, but I've lived in Toronto for 20 years. I'm still getting used to different landscapes around Ontario. And one of the ones that Wildlands League is most associated with is the landscape of the boreal forest. And we've worked there for many years, working with Indigenous groups and communities and stakeholders and mining companies, forest companies, working on caribou conservation, looking at the impacts of mining, working with forest companies on improving forest practice in Northern Ontario. So we've long been associated with this landscape, but we're also associated with and have a history in Southern Ontario. We were involved with the establishment of Georgian Bay National Park, Bruce Peninsula National Park along Georgian Bay, and most recently with Rouge National Urban Park in the GTA, pictured here. So we do have a bit of a history in Southern Ontario, and our latest foray into the Southern Ontario landscape was inspired by really this map that was done by Jeff Bowman and others out of Trent University, and it's a map of how terrestrial vertebrates, four-footed creatures, could use the landscape. And in this map, the reds and the yellows, the warm colors are good connectivity for four-footed animals, and the blues and the green cool colors are poor connectivity. So for example, the GTA is not a good place for animals to cross through, and neither is Lake Simcoe, but the Niagara Escarpment and the Oak Ridges Moraine and the Niagara Peninsula and a lot of the areas protected by the Greenbelt are still in good shape, and Central Ontario is still in good shape. So we're a bunch of map geeks, and we looked at this, and Janet was like, well, how can we use this information to increase connection and protection across Southern Ontario? So she kind of sent me on a bit of I thought it was a wild goose chase, frankly, to see how that could be done. But we started seeing opportunities, and this is from the Crown Land Use Planning Atlas, a bit of a rough map of kind of Central Ontario. But right in the middle, you've got QE2, Queen Elizabeth II Wildlands Park, and there are kind of stepping stones of Crown land that go from there to Algonquin, these beige areas are crown land, and then the greener areas are protected areas. They go up to Georgian Bay as well, and then over to Kawartha Highlands Provincial Park near Peterborough. And then down as far as we were showing before, the Greenbelt actually comes quite far up Lake Simcoe, and you can have that connectivity right there. So we ended up working with pilot groups, the Couchiching, I hope I don't miss anybody, but the Couchiching Conservancy, the Georgian Bay Land Trust, Muskoka Land Trust, Kawartha Land Trust, Halliburton Land Trust, all represented by the Ontario Land Trust Alliance. Also, the Nature Conservancy of Canada had some input, and we had Gary Pritchard from Cambium Aboriginal, a member of Curve Lake First Nation, who advised us on the Indigenous aspect of this and reconciliation aspects. So thanks to the stewardship of Indigenous communities over thousands of years, and then more recently by some of these groups, we still have some connectivity to and maintenance on this landscape. And after working on this for 6 months or more, we came up, now this is it's a possibility map of what could be key components of crown land or unceded land, private holdings in Ontario to maintain the connectivity across this landscape forever. So that on this map, the lime green areas are general crown land use areas, the dark green are protected areas, the white areas are private land holdings, and then these pink areas are what are called, they're a form of crown land called enhanced management areas, where there's some restrictions for remoteness, but they still allow commercial logging and other extractive activities in them. So this is like a map of possibilities, what puzzle pieces could be put together to maintain and enhance this connectivity through this landscape. Because while there's currently fairly good connectivity and connections here, there's a lot of threats from quarrying, mining, infrastructure, residential and commercial home development, all kinds of things, and climate change, of course, and more coming down the pipe. So this, again, this has no, this is a map of possibilities. It's got no concrete use or implementation right now, but it's something that could happen in the future, and we've kind of laid the groundwork. And this is really an amazing area. So it is a near wilderness. It's only half the distance from the GTA to Algonquin, but you've got some of the same features here. It's a paradise for hikers and bikers and birders and naturalists. We went up just when the spring, the ice was just off the lakes, and the flowers are coming out on the trees and the forest floor, and it's just an amazing landscape. Kind of looks like the Ottawa Valley, except it's got a lot more species at risk. It's got, some of it has Massasauga rattlesnakes, it's got blanding turtles, it's got Ontario's only lizard, the five-lined skink. Now, where else in Ontario could you have a lizard running literally beneath the hooves of a moose at some point? Well, hopefully the moose won't trample it, but you get the idea. So it's just an amazing area, and it's important for those, everything from insects to reptiles, the moose we talked about. Algonquin wolf could theoretically roam unmolested from Georgian Bay right across through QE2 to Kawartha Highlands and up to Algonquin Park, and especially if this landscape was conserved in the future. So a lot of possibilities there. And when you think of immediately when you think of the green jobs around this, you think of tourism, you think of biking, hiking, photography, all the stuff we talked about. But then Jannett had that whole host of a list of other occupations that would need to be put to work if you were to implement a vision here or in Windsor or anywhere else. And then when you're thinking about private land, you've got real estate agents that need to be involved. You've got surveyors that need to be involved. You've got a whole host of other things that we don't think of as the green economy, but actually are part of implementing that vision. So there's a lot of economic impacts, and then just the green infrastructure, the value of that itself, let alone the jobs, the flood protection and the home protection that's provided by wetlands. Greenbelt, Friends of the Greenbelt Foundation did a study on the Greenbelt that wetlands are worth $1 million on average in terms of flood protection. So critically important. Now, when we got started on this connectivity kick, we kind of it's hard to contain it. I mean, Janet's talking about across the country now, but we expanded to Southern Ontario, and we thought, well, what if we worked with other groups, Friends of the Greenbelt Foundation, Carolina, Canada, Ontario Nature, municipalities, to just see what other opportunities there are. And so we kicked off what we're calling our Nature Connectivity Project. And it's a vision of expanding protection and connection, restoration, all the way from Windsor to Algonquin, and from Tobermory to Peterborough, and including the Greater Golden Horseshoe and the Greenbelt. And so it's a big vision. And when Jannett starts talking like that, you know, people listen. She got invited to places, and we got invited. We got a call from Bryan Massey and folks in Windsor to talk about and come down and join them down in Windsor. And Windsor is a very different landscape. It's in on the edge of Essex County, and Essex County has, I think, 6% forest cover, where most of Southern Ontario has 25% forest cover, and ecologists tell us you need a minimum of 30% forest cover for a really healthy watershed. So no wonder Windsor, well, and they've channelized and straightened a lot of their streams so that they're basically drains for wetlands in that area. Now, we've benefited from agricultural products, but there's been a cost. So Windsor is the flood capital of Canada. It's very almost impossible to get flood protection in Windsor, partly because of what we've done to the landscape. But when we went down there, it's just amazing what the folks in Windsor have done. So they have preserved a remnant of tall grass prairie, a sort of a necklace of protection, both provincial and municipal, called the Ojibwe Prairie Complex. And the tall grass prairie is the most endangered ecosystem in Canada. It's got over 160 rare species and 55 species at risk, including Massasauga rattlesnakes, interesting again. But it's also, tall grass prairie is also the most resilient ecosystem to climate change. And this network has tall grass prairie, it's got savanna. It's just an amazing set of protection. And it's kind of the missing piece is this place that's being called Ojibwe Shores, which is owned by Transport Canada, but it is a walnut savanna, black walnut savanna, which I'd never heard of before. And we took a tour. Bryan Massey invited us down, and even though he'd organized a whole evening of speakers to come, an amazing event, Jannett spoke at it, he took the whole afternoon to take Eugenia and I on a tour around Windsor, and to see, this is late August, and to see the prairie in bloom with all kinds of flowers and butterflies and birds, it's just amazing. And this tour culminated at Ojibwe Shores, and as we entered the Black Oak Savanna, I just thought we're in the deep south. It was almost like being in a rainforest. I mean, the different species of insects that I don't hear in Toronto humming away in the trees, the black walnut, and there's vines hanging down like lianas from a Tarzan movie. We're in the deep south of Ontario, and then these birds take off overhead, start circling around, and there's an osprey that's being mobbed by starlings or whatever they were. I thought, well, that's pretty cool. I don't see a lot of ospreys in Toronto. And then we get out on the shore, and there's a bald eagle takes off from a cottonwood, takes off, and then in the background there's the industrial Mordor of Detroit across the river. Here's a picture of the young guy on the right side is Bryan Massey on the shore of the Detroit River. And it's just amazing. It's a great example of what can be achieved and what can be maintained, even in the heart of a sort of an industrial and urban area. To go back to Janet's puzzle pieces, now if we think about Ojibwe National Urban Park as a near urban, protected area, and Ojibwe Shores as kind of the anchor piece, and then you connect out to the broader landscape along Turkey Creek through a restoration green infrastructure project, and then into the rural countryside, and connect the areas along the Canard River down to the headwaters of Cedar Creek, which go down to a conservation area down here. You can think about connecting out to the broader landscape. And you can even imagine connecting around Leamington to Point Pelee National Park and having, critters, whether they're possums or southern flying squirrels, be able to travel from Windsor to Point Pelee. And it's pretty exciting. And then the hazard of all this, when you start thinking and getting these ideas, where do you stop? because there's so many opportunities. There's this area of, remember the red and the warm colors are good connectivity. This area down there, this is the Thames River, and it runs right through the traditional territory and the current territory of the Chippewas of the Thames. And there's no accident that their territory actually has some of the best connectivity in Southern Ontario. Right into the City of London, where they're putting forward municipal areas as being recognized for permanent protection, and then around the Greater Golden Horseshoe and Niagara and these areas. And you've got lots of examples. London, the Chippewas of the Thames, as I mentioned. Carolina and Canada, we're now associated with them, are working throughout this zone to protect areas. We've got Coots to Escarpment, which was a cool initiative to connect Coots Paradise right at the toe of Lake Ontario with the Niagara Escarpment. And then to make kind of come full circle, come back to the Rouge and the efforts that are going there, not only within Rouge, but around the, you can think about the boundaries of the Rouge, kind of having a shadow effect and creating connection to the Greenbelt and then back up to Central Ontario. So the challenge is, where do you stop with this? And I say, don't stop, just keep going. Yeah. So this is my last slide. I'll hold it there, but just a summary that, these are some of the examples that we're working on with other groups in Southern and Central Ontario that kind of provide a picture of what Jannett was talking about in a more abstract term. And there's just so many examples and so much good work happening there. It's very exciting. And we'd like to see it expand and across Canada and more in this area. So I'm going to leave it there. I think we're going to turn it back over to Eugenia.
Yeah, so thanks so much, Dave and Jannett. Great to hear about all the good work that we're doing since I'm part of Wildlands League. We would love to hear any questions that any of our participants might have, so please take a moment and submit your questions.
So Dave, I have a question for you. How had you never, like when you talk about that savanna, that was a black oak savanna or a walnut savanna or?
Black walnut savanna.
Black walnut savanna.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, it's pretty rare. I mean, there's oak savannas are kind of the ones that people think of that are more common. I mean, there's an oak savanna in Hyde Park in Toronto. Uh-huh. But I'd never heard of a black walnut savanna. That's right. Walnuts don't grow in dense clumps generally, but this is like almost exclusively walnut. They're usually here and there through the forest, and yeah, it was pretty cool.
So we have a question here, and this might be a question for Jannett, but Dave, please feel free to chime in. What are the impediments to this vision, and how would you overcome them?
So right now, this work is happening very much at a volunteer scale. When you look at restoration, we've got Carolina and Canada and many other groups who are actually creating energy and excitement around replantings and reforestation and working on these projects. But there is not a single driver that brings it all together. So you'll have a city who might be looking to do green restoration projects or maybe green infrastructure projects, and they're applying to other levels of government for funding, and their project isn't big enough, that it doesn't meet this criteria. And we haven't, kind of like what Green Infrastructure Ontario pointed out in their recent report, is we haven't got sort of an alignment of government policy and purpose and setting targets. So for example, if you set a target inside a city that you had to have X percentage made out of green infrastructure, it would actually help drive the creation of green infrastructure. That being said, green infrastructure projects don't necessarily or inherently talk to projects about getting more protection. So for example, Rouge National Urban Park was created in Toronto, but it doesn't necessarily right now talk to the initiatives that are ongoing in the city of Toronto to do restoration work along the two other ravines, the Humber and the Don. And so why are we not convening that conversation? Why isn't that happening? And it's happening because these departments and governments work in isolation. It's a great idea, for example, to be working out on the agricultural landscape where you have great programs like Alice that are working with farmers and doing restoration and stewardship projects, but those don't necessarily talk to new protection in the Rouge or talk to green infrastructure. And so what I'm suggesting is this is a way to hopefully bring it all together, talk about it as a green restoration economy and a nature strategy for Southern Canada, and on purpose have all levels of government say, yep, we're willing, we're in, we're going to participate. And the way to overcome that is to hopefully, I believe, start a bit of a citizens movement saying this is what we want to see in the restructuring of our economy and how we emerge from COVID. And I think, and Wildlands League is committed to seeing this vision, and we're working to convince many thousands of others and talking to folks across Canada about how that could happen. We're also talking to the federal government and provincial governments and saying, we believe this is the way to venture forward and emerge stronger, both from an economic perspective, but also in terms of human health. And in terms of individuals, they can all be participating right now. And many of you are, whether you're a gardener in your home, whether and you're doing restoration and planting native species, or whether you're working with your local church group and you might be doing a restoration project, or maybe you're supporting your municipality, an MP or whoever, in terms of getting a new naturalized area or native plants planting project going forward. You could be somebody who's working in the industry. You could be somebody who has a greenhouse and is producing native plants. It could be all the way along that, but actually starting to ask for a nature economy that's based on nature and restoring nature, and that builds this strategy for Southern Canada, essentially where most Canadians live. That's my answer to that question.
Okay, great. And you mentioned many different types of jobs. Obviously, today was just a snapshot of some of the different jobs that could be produced out of this. There's a question here about parks and restoration projects often create a large amount of seasonal and short-term contract work. So how would a nature strategy prioritize the creation of more long-term jobs in Parks and Rec?
I'll maybe let Dave take an attempt at this, but in terms of the actual study of the economy of this, I would actually say this is an area where Wildlands League are not experts in this, but rely on the expertise of others. And we look at the Green Infrastructure Ontario report with great enthusiasm, because it talks about 103,000 jobs in 2018 and growing to 250 by 2030. They don't actually quantify whether those are seasonal or what have you, and some of those are seasonal. But for example, the planning of the project is not going to be a seasonal job, and doing the facilitation and the work with other people, the engineering expertise you'd need, the actual scientists who actually have to plan all of the species reintroduction. Working on Blanding's turtles is not something you just go out and release the Blanding's turtles, but it's a years long project to be doing that work. So there are many jobs in that chain of jobs that would be seasonal, but there are also many other jobs that would be the long-term jobs that backstop all of that work. Dave, do you want to?
Yeah, and just we've, as a society, we've made policy choices too that have cut back on the funding for those types of jobs. So we could make different policy choices and have more funding for more long-term jobs, and because a lot of parks are open year round, and as much as nature gets a bit of a break in the wintertime because it's not overrun with visitors, there's probably space for people to experience these parks in the winter and in the shoulder seasons, and then you can have more funds and more demand for staff in some of these places. So,
yeah,
great. And how risky are the red and yellow areas to development now, and what is most urgent to protect?
Well, that's the $1 million question, and we're actually working with a bunch of groups, many of which I already alluded to it and mentioned, that to figure that out and sort of do a prioritization exercise and find out. But so the red areas where they occur naturally, if you think about animals as electrons moving through a wire, those are pinch points where the wire is getting really hot, and there may be natural pinch points between lakes and whatever. but there's also unnatural pinch points between, say, between two cities that are growing together, and that area is getting smaller and smaller. So there's more resistance, I guess, for animals to move through that. So you don't want to be creating any more artificial pinch points, and you probably want to maintain the ones you've got. So there is a bit of a priority there in terms of the red ones when you think of them in an urban context or near urban context.
Yeah, and I would add that Southern Ontario is the extinction hotspot for Canada. It actually has the highest number of endangered species, the least amount of area protected, and the greatest threat in terms of development. And so one of the reasons that we're focused here is because it is that extinction hotspot, and yet we can still see amazing opportunity. And so this is a call to all levels of government to start getting on this and see this as a great opportunity for economic development, and see it as an opportunity for us to reconnect with nature. One of the things that struck me about COVID was how many Canadians really just couldn't wait to get out into nature, and the fact that we didn't have enough. We didn't have enough for people to actually be out in it. So this is again, not about just growing a stronger economy, but also about regenerating more livable cities and connecting to nature and bringing nature into our cities so that we can feel it, touch it, and taste it, and get out in it. And that's what this vision is about, is creating this nature strategy and associating that with a restoration economy and recognizing all of the thousands or hundreds of thousands of jobs that perhaps we don't even realize are backstopping all of this work and making it happen.
Great, thanks. And we have another question here. Earlier in December, we had launched our Logging Scars report. So all that whole project really looking at the logging industry in Canada. And there's a question here about, are there any connections with that and what we're proposing now, this restoration economy? Are there any connections there?
Well, the restoration economy is about regenerative practices from where we've actually damaged nature or where nature has been damaged. And that would include areas that you might have done logging in or doing seismic exploration. And I hope to have another expert on in a few weeks to talk about the regeneration of seismic lines in particular. So I'm not getting to the logging scars yet, but the seismic lines, for example, in Alberta, there's over 300,000 kilometers of them. And seismic lines occur when you're basically doing exploration for oil and gas or energy resources. And so these could actually be restored and be part of a restoration economy. Similarly, there would be possibilities for restoration where we have done logging. The logging scars work, we've looked at that, and we're trying to figure out right now whether or not it would be restorative to the forest to go in and try to recover that, or whether it would create more damage. There is some, we've been speaking to some experts who work in Alberta about the ability to actually restore areas that have been damaged. And we've not yet come to a conclusion on that, but we are actually actively looking into it to see how much of it could we restore and how much we have to accept that this is the damage that's been done, and by going in we would create or unearth more damage. So it's an active question for us. We are considering it because it would be obviously one of the places that you could go for solutions and try to create and regenerate nature. But we want to make sure that we're doing it in a way that doesn't cause more damage.
Wonderful. One more question. Do you prioritize certain species or factors in connectivity planning and decisions? So species at risk, certain ecosystems, for example. Maybe this is a question for Dave.
Yeah.
Again, we're not experts in this field. We're kind of, we use science, and I'm learning every day about this. So there can be certain species, not that one's more important than the other, but they can be indicative of connectivity. So Eugenia actually last week was just sharing how she saw a porcupine outside Guelph, but porcupines don't really go much further than that south, partly because the connectivity is not there. They need at least a minimum amount of tree cover to be able to move across the landscape, and maximum amount of roads, like not too many roads, because they end up as roadkill. And growing up, Down here, you see possums and different things, cats as roadkill. In the Ottawa Valley, it's porcupines. They're the slow-moving target that gets hit. So they could be sort of indicative of how good your landscape is. But you could study almost any animal, and they would have, at a certain scale, they would have landscape requirements, you know? So a bear has huge landscape requirements, a porcupine smaller. If you're studying like smaller things like chipmunks in the ravines of Toronto, they have a smaller need for connectivity, but they still have connectivity needs.
So can I just maybe paraphrase what Dave, I think you're saying is many of these animals, it's not about picking losers and winners, but rather saying each of them gives you information in terms of how you're planning your connectivity project. And I guess it's also important to look at what's the opportunity. And the other thing, the great thing about this is once you start, then more opportunities. We've found this. We've gone out and said, we've thrown floor maps on the rooms of places where we're going and having conversations and just saying, tell us your ideas. What's happening in this area? Who else has got another project? And when you start to do that, and you start to ask people to build it from the ground up, build it from the top down, you get amazing results. And the fact that we haven't done this is just, it's just a missed opportunity. And we have the opportunity now to deliberately plan, bring all these pieces together and start to create an interconnected network of natural areas that could really revitalize Southern Canada and see it as a strategy for Southern Canada.
Fantastic. All right, so that is the end of our webinar. Thank you so much for everyone for joining us today. Please take a moment and fill out our survey after this webinar. It would be fantastic to know what your thoughts are, if there are any questions that we have missed. And also thank you to everyone for your generous donations. That really helps us continue this work. So I hope everyone has a safe and happy weekend. And thanks so much, Jannett and Dave, for joining us today.
Thank you.
Pleasure.
Okay, thanks everyone.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.